Chapter 21. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. Real or fake doesn't matter. Translator. Nyo.bo Studio Editor. Nyo.bo Studio. Yun Shi gazed coldly at them, and the warmth in her heart gradually froze over. It wasn't like she didn't understand how much Liang Xiuqin hated her. Even now, when she recalled the burning pain the moment the sulfuric acid had been splashed on her face, her entire body would tremble with hatred. But even if this was the case, she still had to return to the Yuns. She could only avenge her previous life by returning to the Yuns and reclaiming her identity as the eldest heiress of the Yun family. Uncle. I'm hungry. Yun Shi interrupted their bickering at an opportune time, and it was only then that Liang Weimin finally snapped back to reality. A hint of regret flashed across his face. He was enraged by Chen Lixue. They were arguing in front of the kids and ended up on such a topic. Yun Shi, Uncle will make you something delicious to eat right now. Uncle will take you to town after we finish eating. Chen Lixue instantly panicked when she noticed that Liang Weimin still hadn't given up. She raised her voice and screeched. Liang Weimin, have you actually lost your mind? You really don't care if your own daughter dies because of this little b***tch. If Cindy would actually be brought back home, she would certainly want to take her own life. Do you actually want to see your daughter die? Liang Weimin paused. He understood his own daughter well. Cindy had always been superficial and haughty. Even if she told everyone else that she went to Jingdu to visit her aunt, it wouldn't result in her humiliation. But with all the drama ensuing today, the entire village already knew that Chen Lixue had sent her there to replace Yun Shi. If he brought Liang Cindy back from Jingdu just like that, she would certainly become stubborn. Chen Lixue didn't hesitate to bait him further when she saw his hesitation. She continued to threaten, I'm warning you, if you dare to bring this little b***tch back to Jingdu, I'll divorce you. Liang Weimin was stuck between a rock and a hard place. One was his daughter, and the other was his niece. He was bound to hurt one if he sided with the other. Yun Shi. Liang Weimin was very regretful and conflicted as he turned around to look at Yun Shi. He couldn't make up his mind. Yun Shi had already anticipated this to happen on the way back. Although she was disappointed by her uncle's weakness, she wasn't too saddened by it. After all, she would always be considered an outsider in this household. Uncle, you don't need to see me off. I'm already grown up now, so I can go back by myself. But you're a child, and Jingdu is so far away from here. Chen Lixue made up her mind to not let Yun Shi leave. She yanked Liang Weimin aside as she confidently glared at Yun Shi, her eyes full of aggression. Doesn't matter if it's not so far away or very far away. I will never allow you to leave Yang village. No one in the entire Yun family wants to welcome you anyway, so they will kick you out even if you go back there. You should stay in our home, instead, so at least you won't starve to death. Yun Shi sneered, her glossy eyes glimmering icily. So auntie isn't worried that cousin will be kicked out since she went back there to replace me. You don't need to worry about that. Your grandfather was the only one asking for you to return to the Yuns, while your parents wish that you die outside somewhere instead of going home and cursing them. I already put Cindy's fortune from the fortune teller into her bag when she left. As long as Liang Xiuqin sees the fortune, she will continue on with the mistake and allow Cindy to stay even if she finds out she's not her daughter. Xine is destined for a life of wealth, while you're a star of death. Real or fake doesn't matter to Liang Xiuqin. If she really cared about this daughter, how could she not have asked about her at all in over 10 years? Moreover, Liang Xiuqin still had 2 other daughters. As if she cared about losing one. Although this was the truth, Chen Lixue purposely spoke harshly. This wretched girl would only give up her desire to return to the Yuns if she lost all hope. Yun Shi was actually impressed by Chen Lixue's calculative nature. She'd actually managed to consider it all so thoroughly. It was no wonder that Liang Cindy had managed to marry a tall, handsome, and rich man in her previous life, despite being very pregnant. As such a formidable and calculating mother, it was apparent that reincarnation into the proper family was a real skill. That's enough. You need to shut your mouth. Liang Weimin was very ashamed by Chen Lishue's words. He truly couldn't hold his head up in front of his niece anymore. The Yuns will probably not send over any more living allowances, so I pray that auntie can continue living in luxury. Yun Shi sneered sarcastically before turning to look at Liang Weimin. Uncle, you don't need to feel conflicted or see me off. Yun Shi. Liang Weimin still wanted to say something, but Yun Shi had already waved her hand and smiled innocently. I'm so hungry. I'll help Uncle make dinner. Okay. Chapter 22. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Escape Translator. Nyo.bo Studio Editor. Nyo.bo Studio. In order to prevent Yun Shi from escaping unnoticed, Chen Lishue and Liang Dani took turns watching her. When they went to bed that night, Chen Lishue made up an excuse to have Yun Shi move to Liang Dani and her sister's room. This would make it easier for Liang Dani to keep an eye on Yun Shi. The bedroom shared by Liang Dani and her sister was 3 times the size of Yun Shi's room that had been refitted from a storage room. There were 2 beds in the room, and it was much more spacious than her little hole in the wall. To make them let down their guard, Yun Shi decided to go with their plan. Yun Shi casually threw into a corner the bag she'd packed from her other room. After a stressful evening, Liang Dani was too lazy to help Yun Shi tidy up since she had to focus on keeping an eye on her. However, Yun Shi was in a very good mood. She immediately crawled into bed and grabbed a book to read. Just as she'd expected, she heard the sound of the door lock outside the room just past 10 p.m. Since Chen Lishue was keeping such a close eye on her, tonight was her only and best chance of escaping unnoticed. People typically slept the most deeply between 12:03 a.m. Liang Dani had always been pampered well and rested at scheduled times, so she would surely be asleep by 9 p.m. But since Liang Dani had to keep an eye on Yun Shi that night, she didn't sleep. Liang Dani nervously delayed her sleep until 11 p.m., which was much later than her normal bedtime. Yun Shi checked the clock before turning off the light and going to sleep. Under the blanket, she squeezed the key she'd cut at the village entrance that afternoon. In the darkness, she closed her eyes as she listened to the sound of Liang Dani's breathing. She waited for Liang Dani to fall asleep and be completely sound asleep. She waited for some time before she heard a rooster cry quietly nearby. She knew it was about time. Quietly climbing out of bed, she grabbed her backpack and walked to the edge of the door to cut off the screen on it. Reaching her hand outside the wooden frame, she opened the lock. Doors in the countryside were made with half wooden boards and half screens for the purpose of ventilation. The window screens were covered with short curtains as partitions and to preserve feng shui properties. And it was precisely due to such a design that she was able to open the lock from the inside. Otherwise, she wouldn't be able to open the dead-bolted door from the outside even if she copied Liang Dani's key. Walking out of the room, Yun Shi carefully looked at her home of over a decade under the glow of the moonlight. Although she had been under someone's roof, it still shielded her from the wind and rain, thus she still had some feelings for it. But even the strongest feelings couldn't compete with her desire to return to Jingdu. In this lifetime, she would never compromise or acquiesce anything that belonged to her again. It was a 6-kilometer road from the village to the town. A bullet train directly connecting to Jingdu was put in place several years ago, and she would be able to walk to the train station before dawn. L.rg. She could still vaguely recall how there was usually a direct bullet train to Jingdu at 7 a.m. By the time Chen Lishue realized Yun Shi had run off and chased after her, it would probably be too late. In the early morning, Mu Feiqi was training Great White's running speed. After a few laps, he was also bathed in sweat. Boss! Qi Yuan and Feng Rui stood on the sidelines and had no choice but to interrupt him when the time was cutting close. Qi Yuan brought a file over and walked up when he saw Mu Feiqi stop. Boss, there's an urgent matter. Mu Feiqi wiped his face and drank some water before taking a glance at the file. His eyes darkened slightly. We are returning to Jingdu immediately. Qi Yuan, notify the bullet train to add another car. Team A will be wearing civilian clothes and going on the bullet train, Team B will be going by vehicle, and Team C will be going by helicopter. Roger. I'll notify everyone right now. Great White probably knew that Mu Feiqi was about to leave, so he clenched his paws and patted his feet as he looked up with a sad and adorable face. Mu Feiqi would always leave it behind and refuse to bring it with him, he was basically treating it like a pet cat. I wasn't planning on leaving you here, you'll be leaving with a helicopter. If I make a big fuss of bringing you on the bullet train, that'll surely scare everyone off the train. He raised a hand to pat Great White's head before getting up to walk inside. He left Great White with the veterinarian. Chapter 23. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Create an opportunity translator. Nyo.bo Studio Editor. Nyo.bo Studio. As soon as Liang Dani woke up, she noticed Yun Shi's disappearance, and even the backpack in the corner was gone. She instantly began screaming shrilly. Mom! Mom! Yun Shi ran off. She yanked open the door, but it was still deadbolt shut from the outside. However, the screen had already been cut off. Chen Lixue also ran over from the kitchen when she heard the loud screams and hurriedly opened the lock. Mom! Yun Shi ran off. What do we do? Don't worry. We'll go to town and chase after her right now. Chen Lixue ripped off her apron and ran outside as soon as she heard that Yun Shi had escaped. However, she was stopped by Liang Weiman as soon as she got out of the house. What are you chasing her for? Even if you run over there right now, the train would have left already. Chen Lixue was at her wit's end. Old Liang, what should we do? If she ends up returning to the Yuns, this will force Cindy to take her own life. Liang Weiman glanced at her and, although he hadn't expected Yun Shi to run off, this could be considered the best ending for her. He was useless as her uncle and stuck in the middle, so this was the most he could do for her. Yun Shi has never seen her parents, nor does she know the Yun's address. She might not be able to find the Yuns even if she returned to Jingdu, so what are you even worried about? Liang Weiman was speaking the truth, and this was precisely what he was worried about since he didn't know where Yun Shi would run off to. The outside world was a very complicated place, so there was no way she could handle it as a girl who had never experienced anything before. The train had already left, so he didn't even know where to go find her. Chen Lixue finally realized that this was the truth, even if the wretched girl returned to Jingdu, it might not even impact them at all. Right. She doesn't have any money on her, so she might even run back here if she can't find the Yuns. She's just a girl who doesn't know anything, so she should suffer a bit and learn a few hard lessons so she knows what's good for her. Chen Lixue would wait for Yun Shi to come back home after all. Even if the Yuns stopped sending living allowances to them, Chen Lixue still had ways to make Yun Shi drop out of school and start working so she could earn money to support them. Yun Shi's nerves finally calmed down when the train started to move. She had bought a ticket for a seat on the train. It would take more than 10 hours to arrive at Jingdu, and she was bored with nothing to do, so she began examining the jade pendant hidden in her backpack. It was a white, jade pendant carved into the shape of a dragon, with exquisite workmanship and translucent stone quality. She had brought this jade pendant to the village when she was young, but it didn't belong to the Yuns. This had been gifted by the Jiangs when they'd agreed to the arranged marriage with the Yuns all those years ago. Chen Lixue had always coveted the jade pendant, and it would have probably fallen into her clutches if it hadn't been for her uncle stopping her. When Liang Xini replaced Yun Shi in returning to Jingdu, she took a pair of silver bangles that Chen Lixue had stolen from Yun Shi when she'd been young. These were engraved with her name, Yun Shi. But the most important object was the jade pendant, and a major reason why her grandfather had asked her to return to Jingdu was to execute the arranged marriage between her and the Jiangs. After all, she would be 18 in another year. In her previous lifetime, the Yuns had exerted all efforts to latch onto the Jiangs because of this marriage. As for Yun Shi, she had been used as a pawn and taken advantage of by her father over and over again to squeeze out any remaining value she possessed. Even her biological mother had been cold-blooded enough to ruin her face with sulfuric acid, and it had all been for the sake of this marriage. Yun Shi couldn't help but touch her face when she recalled these memories. She could still redo everything, so she must learn to calculate the next 10 steps before taking the next one and proceed with the utmost vigilance. Liang Sini had returned to the Yuns by now. With how superstitious Liang Shiqin was, there was no way she would accept Yun Shi, even if she brought this jade pendant back with her. So she had to create an opportunity to make the Yuns personally escort her home. She hadn't yet planned out this opportunity, but there was a long road ahead that gave her ample time to plan it properly. The coach was noisy, with several kids near her running and jumping in the corridor. She looked around the coach and noticed a well-dressed mother and son sitting diagonally from her. The wealthy lady took great care of herself and had a delicate mole by the corner of her lips that accentuated the feminine allure of her entire face. Yun Shi thought that face looked somewhat familiar. Frowning in thought for some time, she finally remembered who this woman was. Chapter 24. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Panicked Fury Translator. Nyo.bo Studio Editor. Nyo.bo Studio. Yun Shi hadn't expected to meet a member of the Jiang family here. This woman was none other than the aunt of Jiang Henglin, the man she'd been arranged to marry. Grandfather Liang had 2 sons and 1 daughter. His daughter, Jiang Wanyun, married Chen Ziliang, the eldest son of the Chen family, which was also one of the 4 great clans of Jingdu. With the support of 2 of the great clans, Jiang Wanyun could be considered to be a woman possessing the most prestigious title, aside from the lady. The train had passed through Muyang from a neighboring precinct, and from their casual clothes, they were probably visiting family or taking a leisurely trip. She couldn't help but take a glance at the man sitting beside her. He appeared to be about the same age as Master Mu, so he should be Chenyi Chen, the eldest son of the Chens. In Yun Shi's previous lifetime, she hadn't really crossed paths with Chenyi Chen. She recalled merely meeting him briefly one time, or they had probably greeted each other at a business banquet hosted by the Jiangs. At the time, the eldest heir of the Chens had already been a legendary figure in Jingdu and was a favored prodigy of the clan leader. After Yun Shi's rebirth, she somehow ended up meeting them sooner than before. It was still breakfast time, but the noisy children's yelling made the entire coach especially loud. Yun Shi took out a steamed bun stolen from home and ripped it up to nibble on, piece by piece. She saw Jiang Wanyun also take out several multigrain buns for her precious son and considerately pass a glass of water over to him. She didn't put up the airs of a wealthy lady at all. Yun Shi wasn't sure if they behaved so down to earth all the time, or they were simply bored of indulging every day. Or perhaps as a mother, Jiang Yenyun was purposely training her eldest son with life experience. No matter what, Yun Shi had ebbed and flowed amongst the business world for many years and was accustomed to seeing all sorts of human behavior. She was truly shocked to see this mother and son pair. They weren't in the first-class coach, they didn't receive any special treatment, nor did they display any disdain or disgust. Nearby, she could hear Jiang Wanyun explaining the different grains corresponding to the different colors in the multigrain bun. She assumed this precious male heir probably didn't even know how to tell the 5 different grains apart. Suddenly, the train began to shudder, and the 2 children running along the corridor weren't able to stop in time. In the confusion, they were propelled by momentum and directly crashed into Chenyi Chen. Chenyi Chen hadn't yet swallowed the bun in his mouth, and with the sudden collision, the food was lodged in his throat. Chen. What's happening to you? Jiang Wanyun looked at her son, who was clutching his neck with both hands, his face turning purple. She quickly stood up to quickly push away the child who'd crashed into Chenyi Chen. The child was shoved to the ground and hit the seat, so he began to cry. Chen, what's happening? Don't scare me. Chen. The child's crying and Jiang Wanyan's frantic screams instantly threw the entire coach into a flurry of panic. Yun Shi turned around to see Chen Yichen clutching his neck, his face turning purple. With his eyes closed, his expression was painful. Yun Shi instantly reacted to the fact that he was choking. Throwing her steamed bun aside, she ran over and squeezed past the crowd of people to hit him hard on the back. "What are you doing?" Jiang Wanyan screamed shrilly and was also shocked silly by Yun Shi's violent action. She harshly shoved Yun Shi aside, deathly afraid that she'd hurt her precious son. Ednel.co, he's choking, so he's going to suffocate very soon if we don't perform first aid. This was basically her natural duty as a doctor, so she couldn't be worried about anything else. She crawled up to continue slapping him on the back. Jiang Wanyan looked at the young girl, and in her panicked fury, she didn't believe her at all. "Get the hell away from him. Don't you touch my son." Jiang Wanyan turned her back to block Yun Shi off and continuously hit her son on the back but was too afraid to exert any real pressure. "Madam, he can't breathe right now. If you keep delaying things, your son will lose his life." Yun Shi looked at Chen Yichen. He could no longer breathe, so the Heimlich maneuver probably wouldn't work on him anymore. She could only perform emergency first aid. Throwing all caution to the wind, she yanked Jiang Wanyan aside and hurriedly went to her bag to grab a surgical knife she had stolen from Mu Feiqi and threw it into a cup of hot water. Chapter 25. You are listening at novelfull.audio. All hail Master Mu Translator. Nyo I.Bo Studio Editor. Nyo I.Bo Studio. Just as Yun Shi yanked Jiang Wanyan away, she lunged over once again and latched tightly onto the young girl. She saw the surgical knife being wielded and instantly exhaled sharply. She lunged forward to grab Yun Shi's hand. "What do you want to do to my son? Get the hell away from here. I forbid you from touching my son." The coach was very narrow, so Yun Shi was quickly pushed off to the side by Jiang Wanyan. The glass of water on the table crashed to the floor, and the hot water was directly splashed onto the back of Yun Shi's feet. Enduring the pain, she silently watched Jiang Wanyan lose all her composure as a wealthy wife and began to plead with her gently. "Madam, your son has already lost consciousness. If we don't perform emergency first aid, he will suffocate to death in 5 minutes. I studied medicine, so please allow me to save him now." Cradling her previous son, Jiang Wanyan glared at her warily and sternly berated, "You're only a child, what do you even know?" Jiang Wanyan noticed Yun Shi's young age and didn't believe for a second that she had this ability. Who knew what would happen if she were to make an incision? There was also a long period of time before the train arrived at the next station, so he could still die if they couldn't stop his bleeding. But they were on a train right now, so how could she find a doctor immediately? She'd originally intended to bring her son out to experience countryside living and prevent him from being too pampered to possess the responsibility of an heir. But what on earth was happening? If something did happen, how could she ever answer to everyone from the Chen family? Jiang Wanyan looked at her already unresponsive son, completely helpless. Her tears streamed down her face continuously. "What's going on?" A noble figure walked over from the surrounding crowd. Yun Shi looked up when she heard the voice and accidentally made contact with Mu Feiqi's dark eyes. Yun Shi's heart dropped. How could it be such a coincidence? Mu Feiqi was also a bit surprised to meet her here again. He had assumed he would never see this little creature again. However, Jiang Wanyan looked as if her savior had arrived as soon as she saw Mu Feiqi. She quickly grabbed his shirt hem. Looking up, she cried out for help. "Master Mu! I beg you to save my son. Please save him. He's no longer breathing." Mu Feiqi froze briefly before kneeling down to examine Chen Yichen's condition. His dark brows furrowed slightly. "This is bad. He's already lost consciousness." Yun Shi chimed in to remind him, "We must perform emergency surgery by making an incision in his trachea to open a hole for airflow, then place a tube in it to help him breathe." If we delay things for a second more, his brain may lose oxygen. Even if he survives, long-term loss of oxygen to the brain will cause mental impairment. Mu Feiqi raised a brow at Yun Shi. You know how to do that. I do. But this madam is refusing to let me. She had never encountered such a stubborn woman. Come over here. Hurry up. Mu Feiqi didn't dare to hold things up since a life was at stake. Also, this was the eldest heir of the Chen family, who implicated the four great clans of Jingdu. If something were to happen, it would spell big trouble. Jiang Wanyun suddenly became agitated when she saw Mu Feiqi allow Yun Shi to get involved. No way. Master Mu, she's only a little girl. What could she even know? I can't joke around with my son's life. Mu Feiqi glanced at Yun Shi, his gaze firm and intense. She's rescued me before, so I believe in her medical skills and that she has the ability. But there are no buts. Mu Feiqi immediately interrupted her. Time didn't wait for anyone, so he turned around to command his two subordinates, Feng Rui, keep an eye on Mrs. Chen and stop her from coming closer. Qi Yuan, go to our coach and bring the first aid kit. Roger, the two men agreed before quickly executing their orders. BDNV Yun Shi no longer cared if Jiang Wanyun agreed or not. She helped Chen Yichen lay flat and used a surgical knife to begin making an incision on his trachea and perform emergency surgery. Oh. You. Jiang Wanyun's face grew ashen as she watched the surgical knife delve into Chen Yichen's throat. The crimson blood seeped out, and she frantically looked at Mu Feiqi, Master Mu. She. I'll take full responsibility if something happens. There was no particular reason, but he trusted her. Purely based on how she had confidently explained the emergency procedure to him earlier, her confidence and composure were unlike that of a child. He believed she had this ability. Chapter 26. You are listening at novelfull.audio. She was his prey. Translator. Nyo I.bo Studio Editor. Nyo I.bo Studio. There was no first aid equipment on the train, so she immediately took out a pencil from her backpack and removed the lead, then inserted it into Chen Yichen's throat. She blew air slowly into his throat. The series of motions, from making the incision, to opening the throat, to creating an opening, to performing emergency surgery, each step was completed properly and with composure. Mu Feiqi was surprised to discover that her incisions were accurate and well practiced. Not only did her hands remain still, but her intent gaze was completely different from that of the young girl who'd fainted as soon as she had seen Great White. The little creature before him appeared serious and careful as she wielded the surgical knife. Her young face was rosy, like a cute little bunny, exuding the shy aura of a girl. She probably wasn't yet mature at this age and had grown up in the countryside, so her eyes were glossy and lucid. It was rare that they hadn't already been tainted by the world at her age. Yun Shi focuses intently on performing first aid. Much time had already been taken up by Jiang Wanyun's delaying, so she was afraid that she wouldn't be able to rescue Chen Yichen if she was late by even a moment. Luckily, she made it in time. Once the first aid was complete, she was finally able to feel Chen Yichen breathing through his own throat and quickly propped him up. Master Mu, help me out. Yun Shi looked up while she supported Chen Yichen and made him lean forward. Hit his back, hard. She reached out to stabilize his collarbones and pressed down in conjunction with the frequency of Mu Feiqi's hits until Chen Yichen coughed out the piece of bun that had been lodged in his throat. Chen Yichen was finally able to breathe on his own after expelling the object, slowly regaining consciousness. Jiang Wanyun finally sighed in relief when she saw him wake up. She kept thanking the heavens, earth, and Bodhisattva in her heart. Qi Yuan delivered the first aid kit over. Yun took a look at the now conscious Chen Yichen and pressed him down in the chair. Don't move or speak. I'll help you stop the bleeding and prevent infection for the interim, but you still need to get off at the next station and go to the hospital to get stitches. Putting the surgical knife away, Yun Shi stood up and looked at Chen Yichen staring pointedly at her. He moved his lips but was unable to speak. He was looking at her, so she didn't hesitate to look back at him. Her lucid eyes reflected his figure alongside small specks of sparkling starlight. It was like she could see through to his very soul. Chen Yichen blinked slowly and gave a weak smile in an attempt to thank her for saving his life. Yun Shi also smiled back, breaking into a grin since she had saved a life. It was unadulterated, innocent, and joyful. This was when she discovered that this young man was actually quite good-looking. The ignored Mu Feiqi glanced back at the pair, his expression dark as he grabbed the first aid kit from Qi Yuan and stuffed it into Yun Shi's hands. He was looking gloomy. Yun Shi turned around, and the man's intense stare fell onto her face. She suddenly felt as though she was being treated like prey. Right. She was just like his prey. Prey that had fallen into a hunter's trap. The feeling was very peculiar, and she turned away somewhat frantically to open the first aid kit to stop the bleeding and dress the wound. As soon as Feng Rui let go, Jiang Wanyun dashed over to her precious son's side and nervously watched Yun Shi stop the bleeding. An incision had been made across his neck, and he had nearly lost his life, so Jiang Wanyun finally felt truly afraid and looked at Yun Shi with slightly less suspicion and harshness than before. Thank you. Jiang Wanyun was a bit embarrassed when she recalled her rash actions from earlier, especially since it was toward a young girl like that. She felt even more ashamed. Saving lives is an instinctive reaction, you don't need to thank me. She hadn't picked up a surgical knife for a very long time, nor was she still that confident doctor from all those years ago. She wasn't even a doctor anymore. Master Mu, have the twain call the hospital at the next station. Ask the doctor to wait for them at the next station. The eldest heir of the Chens was very precious, and although Yun Shi had saved his life, he still required the hospital to complete the aftercare to prevent her from getting blamed if another accident were to occur. Mu Feiqi nodded and turned to give Qi Yuan the command. Chapter 27. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Her respect for him. Translator. Nyo I.Bo Studio Editor. Nyo I.Bo Studio. After washing the surgical knife and returning, Yun Shi saw Qi Yuan standing beside her seat. He politely beckoned for her to follow him. Miss Yun, Master Mu invites you to another coach. Yun Shi nodded as she packed up her belongings from the table and placed them into her backpack. Everyone was looking at her strangely after what had occurred just now, so it made her feel very uncomfortable. Yun Shi stepped into Mu Feiqi's private coach, which was divided into beds and a dining room. As she looked around, she saw that the entire coach was filled with iron-blooded men, aside from one other woman, Jiang Wanyun. When Chen Yichen saw Yun Shi, he opened his eyes and managed to give her a weak smile. Sitting diagonally from him, Mu Feiqi took up an entire row of seats by himself. With his legs crossed and back leaning against the seat, he stared intently at her. All the men in the entire coach also stared at her automatically. News of the few minutes of first aid she had administered just now had already been circulated throughout the entire coach after Feng Rui embellished the story with his big mouth. Additionally, her previous incident of battling against the wolf pack in the forest caused everyone to look at her with some curiosity and inquisitiveness in their eyes. They had assumed she would be some amazing woman, so they'd never expected that she'd be a young girl who was barely an adult. Curious voices of discussion began to sound in the dining room. Mu Feiqi furrowed his brows, his sharp eyes scanning over the group of men around him as he retorted icily, "Attention, everyone. Turn around. The target is the beds. Go." Stern voices rang out in unison, and everyone shivered, as they didn't dare to whine or question Mu Feiqi. All the men were professionally trained, so they stood still within a few seconds and obediently returned to their beds. She blinked her eyes in confusion and was a bit perplexed. Were they treating her like a freak? Soon afterward, there were only 4 people remaining in the dining room. Yun Shi went up to examine Chen Yichen's wound to see that it had already stopped bleeding. Jiang Wanyun looked at her with respect and gratefulness in her eyes. Girl, what is your name? Are you going to Jingdu as well? My last name is Yun. Yun Shi. Your last name is Yun. Jiang Wanyun studied her carefully, and it was then that she began to examine her properly. Her inky, long hair was pulled up into a ponytail, and she wore an old-fashioned, long-sleeve tee-shirt and long pants that were faded from the wash. She truly looked like a young girl from the countryside. Although she appeared ordinary, she had an extraordinarily beautiful face. Her exquisite brows and brilliant smile accentuated her calm, yet lucid eyes. Although she was youthful, she was suitably beautiful. This was a girl who knew how to properly conceal herself, so she wasn't flashy about showing off her beauty. Although she was inconspicuous, it failed to hide her allure and caused others to have no choice but to study her deeply. With her intuition as a woman, Jiang Wanyun felt that the girl before her would certainly grow up into an alluring and glamorous beauty in a few years. Which Yun family is it? Maybe I happen to know them. Yun Shi blinked. She could tell that Jiang Wanyun was studying and defending against her, so she didn't bother explaining. There are many Yun families in Jingdu, and ours is just a small family of ordinary people. Madam is too kind with her words. If Yun Shi told the truth, then Jiang Wanyun would probably think she'd only rescued her son because of ulterior motives, since the wealthy people had certain ways of thinking. Jiang Wanyun was also thinking the same thing. This was such an ordinary girl from the countryside, so she couldn't possibly have a connection to the Yun family that had a marriage arrangement with the Jiang family. Turning around, she walked toward Mu Feiqi in his seat. She turned her body in the seat directly across from him and looked up to meet his intense gaze. She acted calm, yet respectful, without being too humble. Master Mu wanted to see me for something. Compared to the craziness and obsession other women exhibited when they saw him, Yun Shi looked at him with a very calm gaze. She was completely unperturbed and even displayed some respect. He could tell that this respect wasn't toward his identity as Master Mu, but respect that was only shown to a man. Chapter 28. You are listening at novelfull.audio. A top male specimen like Mu Feiqi. Translator. Nyo I.Bo Studio Editor. Nyo I.Bo Studio. After having experienced a battle against a god of death, the little creature had won with her superb medical skills. She was at an age where she didn't yet know how to control her preferences, so saving someone's life should be something she would feel very proud of. But he didn't detect even a trace of smugness in her eyes. Instead, she appeared as if this were an extremely trivial matter. She probably didn't know that saving Chen Yichen's life had been considered a great favor by the Chens. As long as she made the request, the Chens would be able to give anything she wanted. But she didn't do it. She didn't have any requests and even deliberately cleared up the relationship when Mrs. Chen asked about the Yuns. At such a young age, she'd been able to battle against a wolf pack, identify date-rape drugs from one sip, and she'd even been able to trick Han Wanling into confessing on her own. Today, she'd showed him how she'd been able to smoothly wield a surgical knife to perform a laryngotomy under harsh conditions. The childish little creature before his eyes was like a shroud of mist in front of him. He was becoming increasingly more curious about the truth underneath the mist. Propping her hand under her chin, Yun Shi carelessly watched the handsome man in front of her, her eyes sparkling with tiny flecks of starlight. It was always said that female beauty caused calamity, but that was only because those people hadn't encountered a top male specimen like Mu Feiqi. He wasn't wearing formal attire today, and all the other men in the coach were also going out in casual wear. He wore a gray shirt, black trousers, and white, casual shoes. The ordinary casual clothing on his body accentuated his refined posture and made him appear even more upright. At that moment, he leaned back against the chair as he gazed silently at Yun Shi. His long and lean legs were crossed, with one hand placed on the small table and the other hand on his knee. This was obviously a lazy and casual action, but there was an indescribable attractiveness when he was the one to do it. Although he possessed an extraordinary temperament and naturally carried the airs of a king, he was introverted and intense, so people didn't dare to play tricks in front of him. In Yun Shi's previous lifetime, she had only admired Han Yaotian as a man. Under her blind obsession, she hadn't considered any other men at all. But when she'd actually jumped away from the logical fallacy of her obsession, she finally realized that Han Yaotian was really no comparison against a natural and noble leader like Mu Feiqi. One was born a leader, the ruthless and decisive Master Mu, who had been honed from bloody storms. He carried majestic, male authority, as well as the courage and incomparable pride of someone who held a high position. Another was merely the son of a wealthy family who played around in the business world, using intrigue and fighting with any and all means. But with this thought, just how blind had she been in her previous lifetime? It was truly a bloody lesson. This was the first time Mu Feiqi had been so blatantly stared at. She wasn't being hypocritical or pretentious, nor did she attempt to dodge or act with too much intention. The train sped along the plains, and the sunlight shone in from outside the windows to cast on her tender face. A fuzzy halo appeared on her side profile. She propped up her chin slightly, her long, silky ponytail hanging over her arm. Her thick eyelashes fluttered like fans, and like feathers, they caressed his heart to make him feel itchy and tingly. He suddenly set his leg down and under the table, then their knees touched. A certain feeling of flotation suddenly appeared in the air as soon as they collided. Yun Shi frowned slightly, leaning backward, and angled her leg to block Mu Feiqi's approaching knee. Through the fabric of her pants, she could almost feel the heat emanating from his body. She suddenly recalled how he had been inflicted by a date rape drug in the forest and stolen her first kiss in this lifetime, and her face flushed red. In her frustration, she kicked at the knee that continued to approach her. Using male keenness, Mu Feiqi stretched out his long left leg to block Yun Shi's attack as soon as she made the kick. The two of them fought relentlessly under the table, their attacks refusing to relent for the other person. Chapter 29. You are listening at novelfull.audio. How would you know if you don't try? Translator. Nyo.bo Studio Editor. Nyo.bo Studio. Countless heads poked out from the beds, and everyone widened their eyes to watch the battle occurring under the table. A woman dared to lay a hand on Master Mu, and she was a young girl too. How could everyone not feel curious? Feng Rui poked Qi Yuan's arm as he eyed the movements under the table and gossiped with curiosity, who do you think will win? When have you ever seen our boss lose? Qi Yuan rolled his eyes at him, crossing his arms as he leaned against the window, and languidly watching the drama unfold. Master Mu had never been interested in women before, Yun Shi was the only exception. Although she was merely a young girl, she seemingly allowed them to see a light amidst the darkness. Not only were they curious, but also they were full of anticipation. As soon as he said this, Yun Shi instantly lost the battle. She had only made the kick when she was trapped by Mu Feiqi's powerful knees. She couldn't yank it out, no matter what. Now she was sitting in an extremely flirty position, and if she moved any further, she would be at his life's root. Yun Shi stared annoyedly at the elegant, yet lazy man before her, her delicate face blushing pink and exuding allure. Never mind her tiny frame right now, she probably wouldn't be Mu Feiqi's opponent even if she matured for a few more years. The man across from her straightened in his seat, his gloomy eyes staring directly at her. There seemed to be whirlpools in the depths of his eyes, so deep that they could suck her in. His noble and handsome face carried a hint of flirtation as his thin lips curled upward. Little creature, you're not fast enough to win against me. If you'd actually kicked me, then you'd have to be responsible for my sexual happiness for the rest of my life. His tone was a combination of adoration and teasing, and it made Yun Shi's ears burn hotly to listen. No one had ever used such a flirtatious and intimate nickname for Yun Shi in either of her lifetimes. He was the first one. Yun Shi squinted, the embarrassment and shock fading from her eyes as she used a bit more strength to remove her lodged leg. When she looked up again, there was now iciness in her eyes. Master Mu, please tell me straight if you have something to say. If Mu Feiqi had only asked her to change coaches so he could flirt with her, then she was sorry to say she wouldn't accept his advances. Which part of Jingdu are you going to? His aloof voice was deep and magnetic, with an authentic Jingdu accent that somehow sounded inexplicable in Yun Shi's ears. The Yun family, which Yun family? His slim fingers tapped on the table. It was the same question that Jiang Wanyun had asked, but there was a sense of oppression when it came from him, and it made her fear lying to him. Master Mu is planning to change careers and start checking household registrations. It doesn't look like the work of an old lady from the neighborhood committee suits you very well. How would you know if you don't try? Mu Feiqi's lips pressed slightly together as he replied evenly. His attitude was compromising, aggressive, and overbearing. Another wave of feeling like prey surged up in Yun Shi's heart whenever he stared intensely at her. Jiang Wanyun and her son still sat behind them, and if she were to speak honestly, it would make it seem like she was disrespecting the older woman. This kind of arrogant behavior would only spell future trouble for her. Naturally, she wouldn't dig a hole for herself. I'm only a country girl, and our family is an inconsequential one in Jingdu. It's of no interest to Master Mu. She wasn't going to really cross paths with him again, so she could lie as much as she wanted. Even if she fooled him, a man holding an esteemed position and standing on the top of the pyramid like him would pay no attention to a minor person like her. The more she deliberately stressed this point, the more Mu Feiqi believed that her Yun family in Jingdu was actually not a common family. He was totally cognizant of the entire situation in Jingdu, and when she had mentioned the Yuns, he only had one impression within his database. As far as he knew, the eldest heiress of the Yuns was being raised in the countryside, and she also had an arranged marriage with the eldest heir of the Jiangs. Mu Feiqi couldn't help but recall Qi Yuan's reports. Yun Shi had a ruthless aunt who'd even pushed Yun Shi off a cliff so that her daughter could replace her. It appears that this little creature was none other than the eldest heiress of the Yuns. The Yuns had been successful in the earliest years. However, they had later been dragged down from a few incidents that had resulted in their decline in recent years. Her father, Yun Yuanfeng, hadn't been able to move any further than his position as deputy director, and next year would be time to select and change positions. If he still wasn't promoted to the position of director by then, his future would probably remain at standstill. Since he was calling the daughter with wedding arrangements with the Jiangs back home at this time, it was probably because he was trying to use this marriage to gain the support of the Jiangs. With powerful support from a family like the Jiangs, why would they ever worry about not having a bright future? Chapter 30. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Truly flattered. Translator. Nyo.bo Studio Editor. Nyo.bo Studio. Mu Feiqi didn't continue pestering Yun Shi with questions, so she finally sighed in relief. This man's aura was too aggressive, she really couldn't afford to mess with him. Yun Shi mentally reminded herself to make sure to avoid him whenever she saw him again. Even if she were to have to go against the Hans in the future, she must not get Mu Feiqi involved. She must also do her best to not get him implicated in her plans and avoid getting herself into trouble. They arrived at the next station soon afterward, and Yun Shi continued with her habit of writing Chen Yichen's conditions on a piece of paper and handing it to Jiang Wanyun. Give this to the doctor when you get to the hospital, so they can determine his injuries even more quickly. Miss Yun, thank you for saving my son's life. Can you please leave your contact information, so if we have the chance to see each other again? Yun Shi didn't plan to accept this favor, so she smiled faintly before interrupting her. No need to be so polite, madam. The medical personnel are here, so you should hurry up and get to the hospital. They would meet again sooner or later, and if she actually married into the Jiangs, then she might have to call him uncle in the future. The medical personnel were already waiting on the platform, and Yun Shi escorted them off the train before turning around and directly returning to the coach. Chen Yichen turned around to look at her but wasn't able to say goodbye in time before the medical personnel surged around him. He kept turning around with every step as he walked, watching the figure through the window, as he hoped that the person in the train would turn around to look at him. She still hadn't turned around, even after he had gotten into the car, and Chen felt a wave of regret. He didn't even know if he could ever see her again, and this cruel girl wouldn't even leave him a phone number. The train began to move, and Mu Feiqi raised a brow as he watched Chen continuously turn back as he walked away. Frostiness appeared in his harsh eyes. After Yunxi saw the two important guests off, she finally removed her socks and shoes to examine her foot that had been burnt red by the hot water. Without any burn ointment, she could only endure it until she returned to Jingdu. As she looked up, a dark shadow fell over her, and she keenly raised her head. Just when she was able to react, a man's slender fingers picked up her legs that were resting on the seat and smoothly sat down next to her. Her legs were resting right between his legs in such an awkward and flirtatious position that it instantly caused her to blush. Yunxi attempted to remove her feet but was clamped down by his iron grip. She gave him an exasperated glare and repressed her urge to kick him at between his legs. She gritted her teeth angrily, "Let go." Didn't he know that all the other men in the coach were staring at them? Nonsense. He always started flirting whenever they had a disagreement. How did she not hear about this man's horrible, private behavior from her previous lifetime? Why didn't you say anything about the burns on your foot? He took out a box of ointment from his pocket as he frowned at the red burns on her feet. Her tiny feet were delicate and fair, but her right foot had become reddened by the burn. The red was a sharp contrast against the white. "Master Mu, I can do this on my own. I don't need your help." "Master Mai, can we change positions? My foot is starting to cramp." "Master Mu, you have so many subordinates watching. I'm feeling shy, even if you're not. Let me do this myself." She continued grumbling, but the man focused on applying ointment and didn't hear a word she said. He aggressively clamped her ankles as he applied the light green ointment, layer by layer, on the burned area. Yunxi was speechless and rolled her eyes. She looked up to see the numerous heads poking out from the beds and sighed in exasperation. Their wise and mighty Master Mu was personally taking care of a young girl, so this was probably enough fodder for them to gossip about for a long time. Yunxi felt no honor about becoming the topic of their gossip. "Don't get water on this for the next 2 days. I'll help you apply ointment every 3 hours. Master Mu, you can give me the ointment so I can apply it myself. I injured my foot, not my hands." She seemed truly flattered by how he was personally taking care of her. However, she was not feeling any actual flattery but was actually very uncomfortable by the sheer shock.